Hey guys, tonight we're diving into bustling ancient Mesopotamian markets. Imagine yourself stepping into a sun-drenched bazaar somewhere between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, maybe around 3000 BCE. Vendors shout over each other, scents of date palms mingle with the smoky tang of cooking fires, and dusty patrons haggle over baskets of barley and sacks of silver dust. It's the kind of chaotic hive where trade is king, and ensuring everyone remembers the deal is no small matter. You probably won't survive a day navigating those tightly packed stalls without quickly learning that keeping track of who owes what was essential. Before cell phones, before cash registers, even before paper receipts were a twinkle in someone's eye. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and local time in the comments. I'm curious if anyone's barging into Mesopotamia from a tropical rainforest or a chilly northern city. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the narrow alleyways lined with mud brick shops, where merchants display woven baskets overflowing with barley grains, the base currency alongside silvery bits of metal. In these early marketplaces, currency as we know it wasn't standardized, but the value of goods was understood and bartered. What really fascinates you is the emergence of trade protocols, the earliest ancestors of receipts, those simple but powerful records that guaranteed trust in a world without Netflix rewatches for contracts. Historians still argue whether trade was more about trust or clever record keeping, but no one doubts that the need for accountability grew quickly in these vibrant centers of business. Imagine those merchants shouting out their wares, barley for 2 silver shekels, and then marking down who owes or paid what, lest disputes spiral into fistfights or worse. Without such records, someone could easily deny a debt, causing disruptions that might even attract temple enforcers. These proto-receipts were probably nothing more than a mental note or a common understanding at first, but soon that proved insufficient. The busy marketplaces of Mesopotamia demanded a more durable solution, which came in the form of tokens, clay tablets, and eventually written scripts. Interestingly, we find that barley, rather than gold or silver coins, was the most common means of payment or wealth storage during this period. After all, it was as good as currency. It fed people and livestock, which made it invaluable. So you're not just imagining somebody handing over gold coins as you move through this ancient bazaar, but rather sacks of barley meticulously counted and documented. While you might picture historical trade as a straightforward swap, the reality was far more intricate. These bazaars were probably noisy, multi-layered social hubs where deals were struck not only with goods, but also with promises, credits, and debts stretching days or even months. This would have necessitated some way to keep track, a humble receipt. Today, when you lose a receipt for your online purchase and panic a bit, you're experiencing the descendant of these ancient market packs. But imagine how complex the transactions could get here. How to prove you gave a silver weight in exchange for 10 measures of barley? What if someone tried to cheat? Enter the early forms of record keeping. Uniquely, merchants and traders probably used simple clay tokens, small shapes made from baked clay coded to represent particular goods, to keep track. This system wasn't writing yet, but it bridged the gap between speech and script. You might chuckle at how counting tokens could have looked like a prehistoric board game, with sheep-shaped tokens and grain-shaped ones representing the stock on hand. These little figures were kept in little envelopes of clay, and breaking the envelope would be the equivalent of opening the receipt to verify the contents. Historians still argue whether the token system was first used for administrative control by temples and palaces or for independent merchants. Some say tokens were primarily the government keeping an eye on resources, while others suggest local traders developed them first. Either way, it's a fascinating glimpse into human ingenuity reacting to economic complexity. The hustle and bustle you hear isn't just noise. It's the echo of the birth of economic administration, the humble origins of the receipt, the first proof of purchase humanity ever devised. Next time you toss your crumpled receipt in the trash, think about those early Mesopotamian traders, that dusty, noisy market that probably smelled like fresh barley and sweat, who started it all. You keep moving, carried along by that dusty trade wind, and now you're stepping beyond simple tokens into the somewhat sticky clay world of early record keeping. Once merchants realized clay tokens were good, but not exactly foolproof. Break that clay envelope and the record's spoiled. Someone clever thought, why not impress the record directly onto the clay surface? So picture small clay tablets, freshly baked or still damp, taking on the marks of a stylus and becoming mini contracts, bona fide receipts anchored in real meaning. These early records were much more than scribbles. They were early accounting tools documenting goods traded, debts incurred, or livestock transferred. Anyone involved in Middle Eastern ancient economies quickly learned you had to prove what you had done, or disputes would drop like bobs on the trading floor. These tablets functioned like your modern receipt or invoice, but without the glossy paper or cheerful logos. The clay tablet system wasn't created overnight. Merchants and bureaucrats began with simple marks, lines and circles made by pointed sticks or reeds to denote numbers and items. Those numbers were endlessly cryptic to us, but made perfect sense to those involved, like an ancient version of Excel cells populated by the raw data of trade and labor. Then, over time, the signs became embedded with meaning, shapes for goods, symbols for loans, and notations for repayment dates. One particularly gripping tidbit is that these clay tablets could weigh about as much as a small paperback book and were stored in archives, think ancient filing cabinets, sometimes sorted by temple or palace officials. These weren't casual notes to self, but official documents. Archaeologists occasionally find up to thousands of these tablets from a single excavation, giving us a real-time snapshot of ancient life in a way letters from Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar simply do not. While the earliest clay tablets focused heavily on trade, historians still argue whether their original purpose was administrative oversight by central authorities or grassroots commerce among independent traders. Temples might have needed rigorously maintained records to control grain storage and labor payments, while merchants probably valued these tablets as the only proof they had in a complex marketplace. What's fascinating is how these tablets recorded details spanning from the quantity of sheep traded to the specific days, loans were granted, the names of traders, and even the prices, often in standardized units such as silver shekels or barley bushels. One quirky example includes tablets that record the delivery of beer in measured quantities, which further shows the broad range of commodities managed. You might wonder, how did they actually write on the tablets? The secret lay in a reed stylus, creating wedge-shaped impressions, hence the name cuneiform. The stylized wedge marks pressed into wet clay were both durable and fast to produce, turning the clay surface into a ledger book. Whether it was cold or sticky outside, this method worked, preserving records for millennia, assuming the tablet didn't get crushed first. But here's the catch. These weren't alphabetic letters, at least not like in English. Instead, cuneiform signs were a complex web of logograms and phonetic cues, allowing efficient communication but definitely requiring specialized training to master. Which brings us to a unique cast of characters, the scribes. These folks were the brainiacs, the nerds of their time, who learned how to read, write, and manage these tablets. They were indispensable to ancient economic life, and their existence speaks to how critical record-keeping was. So, while today you might find receipts tucked behind your car's sun visor, in Mesopotamia, the equivalent was a hefty tablet carried in one hand, a stylus in the other, and a reputation for deciphering complex trade networks in your head. Next up, we'll explore exactly how that first real writing system, cuneiform, revolutionized the way these receipts worked, going way beyond mere tokens or simple tallies. You stand on the threshold of one of humanity's grandest inventions, writing itself. In the dusty cradle of Mesopotamia, cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script inscribed on those clay tablets you just got used to, absolutely reshaped civilization's relationship with receipts. This was no longer just about listening, remembering, or holding awkward clay tokens. It was about pulling language out of the air and setting it down in indelible signs. It's like inventing social media, but in clay, a way to communicate, record, and verify with a permanence that human memory simply can't match. Imagine being the first merchant or temple accountant to realize that instead of messing around with piles of scattered tokens representing sheep or jars of oil, you could now carve a series of marks that explicitly say, I received 17 sheep from Erbau on the 3rd day of the month. No possibility of confusion, no fading memories, just a solid, verifiable receipt baked into the Earth's history. Clever, right? Invention often hides in such practical needs. Cuneiform writing began as a series of pictographs, the simplest pictures representing objects, before morphing into more abstract signs that represented sounds and ideas. Over centuries, this sign language evolved into a complex system representing syllables and words, largely driven by the necessity of maintaining accurate economic records. Here's a fun fact. This drive started almost entirely with transactions related to trade and agricultural production. Historians still argue whether the script's development was primarily fueled by commercial needs or by growing bureaucratic complexity in palace and temple administrations. Either way, it stuck around for over 3 millennia. One quirky detail here is how the shape of the stylus, cut to a triangular point, meant the writing took on a distinctive wedge shape. This is why cuneiform gets its name, literally wedge-shaped. Each wedge could represent a word, a syllable, or a quantity. It wasn't something you just picked up. Learning to read and write cuneiform could easily take years of training, usually in special schools run by temples or palaces. Speaking of which, scribes were the rock stars of this era, the interlinked accountants, lawyers, and secretaries. They held enormous social status because literacy was rare and incredibly valuable. It's tempting to think of them as dusty, glowing relics of a bygone age, but consider they were the original data analysts, the gatekeepers of economic trust in these bustling ancient cities. Without them, those clay receipt tablets would just be meaningless doodles. One scholarly debate that keeps cropping up is the transition from pictographic to phonetic writing in cuneiform. Was it a linear, logical progression, or a more haphazard development driven by different user groups adapting the script for their particular needs? Some argue that trade merchants pushed for more streamlined writing to quickly log transactions, while temple officials maintained more elaborate, symbolic forms for ritual and administrative purposes. It's a lively debate between archaeologists, linguists, and historians that keeps cuneiform fresh and exciting centuries later. Cuneiform also found incredible versatility. It wasn't limited to trade alone, but expanded into the recording of laws, treaties, myths, and literature. The famous Code of Hammurabi, which you might recognize as one of the oldest known legal codes, was written in cuneiform. And yet, at its core, cuneiform's heartbeat was commerce. The earliest known receipts, multi-column tablets carefully detailing goods exchanged and payments made, could be considered the ancestors of today's invoices and financial statements. An intriguing, quirky tidbit is that some tablets contain receipts for exotic things like restaurant meals and beer deliveries. Yes, beer was a form of currency and a staple food item. There are records of beer rations being distributed to workers in construction or farming, documented with the same meticulous care as trading silver or livestock. So the next time you grumble over your tab at a pub, at least you aren't justifying ancient Mesopotamian beer economy mathematics. By making transactions transparent and documentable, cuneiform receipts reinforced social contracts. They provided undeniable proof of agreements, reducing disputes and building trust networks. Think of them as archaic, yet highly efficient customer service guarantees. Historians still argue whether these formal receipts were mainly tools to protect institutions like temple treasuries or to empower individual traders navigating complex marketplaces. Either way, the impact is undeniable. So, as you trace your fingers over these wedge marks, remember, this was the spark that ignited literacy, bureaucracy, and recorded history itself. It's humbling to realize that your first online shopping receipt has roots that go way deeper and older than even the oldest dusty library shelf you've ever seen. Next, we'll wander into how temples, those ancient economic powerhouses, took this burgeoning writing system and drove the role of receipts into public and sacred life alike. You follow the trail of cuneiform from dusty trade routes right into the cool, shadowy sanctuaries of ancient Mesopotamian temples, where the economy wasn't just about trade, it was sacred. Temples weren't simply religious centers. They were bustling economic hubs that controlled vast swaths of land, workforce, and resources. Imagine, not a church or a cathedral, but a thriving multinational corporation headquarters embedded with priest accountants who juggled both divine rituals and earthly commerce. It's like your local cathedral suddenly also running a bank, a warehouse, and a payroll office all at the same time. Temples demanded a level of accountability that was unprecedented, primarily because they handled offerings, managed land, and oversaw the distribution of goods. This complexity meant that the use of receipts had to transcend simple trade to satisfy the administrative and spiritual demands of these powerful institutions. You can almost picture rows of shelves lined with clay tablets, receipts, and ledger lists, all chronicling the endless circulation of grain, livestock, and precious metals dedicated not just to gods, but to temple workers and the maintenance of sacred sites. Here's a fascinating twist. Temples functioned as early banks, extending loans of seed grain to farmers with precise accounting recorded in receipts. These loans had to be repaid once the harvest arrived, all documented with exact dates, quantities, and conditions. In some cases, late repayment could mean financial penalties, so these weren't just friendly nudges, they were serious business. Historians still argue whether temple economies were the real power engines behind state formation in Mesopotamia, as the sheer volume and precision of their receipts suggest a well-oiled economic machinery rivaling royal palaces. Moreover, the religious aura surrounding temple administration added a layer of solemnity to receipts. You couldn't simply forge a temple receipt without potentially risking divine wrath. This fusion of ritual and record-keeping gave these documents a quasi-sacred status. Receipts were not just economic instruments, but also kept a moral and legal weight. It's as if a receipt wasn't just proof of a transaction, but a covenant witnessed by the gods. Now, for the quirky bit, some temple records show receipts issued for rations of beer and bread given to temple staff, and even for laborers working on massive construction projects, an ancient paycheck, if you will. These weren't just anonymous transactions. Often, names of workers or officials were listed alongside their received goods, indicating an early form of employment contracts. In one particular find, scholars unearthed a receipt documenting a payment in bread and beer to a scribe for copying sacred texts. Turns out, even in ancient Mesopotamia, you get what you write, literally. Scribes played a starring role here. Think of them as the temple's fiduciaries, juggling vast ledgers, maintaining trust, and preserving order. Their work was pivotal. A poorly recorded or lost receipt could lead to loss of grain, damaged reputations, or wild rumors of corruption. The scribe's meticulousness was the glue holding the temple economy together, reinforcing social hierarchies and enabling complex economic planning. Legal implications were unmistakable. While historians still argue whether temple-issued receipts were legally binding in the strictest sense, or more of a spiritual and administrative assurance, it is clear these tablets had profound implications in disputes and state administration. Temples often functioned as arbitration centers where tablet evidence could settle disagreements, affirming the receipt's quasi-judicial role. Imagine a medieval courthouse where your grocery receipt suddenly got the same weight as a signed contract. That's how revolutionary these practices were. Surprisingly, these receipts occasionally detailed penalties and compensations for damages caused, such as a worker losing a tool or mishandling temple property. This tells us that ancient accounting had evolved beyond simple record-keeping to something resembling risk management, a feature historians debate about since it suggests an early awareness of economic liabilities linked directly to the individual's actions. The big takeaway is this: temples didn't just promote receipts as accounting tools, they elevated them into a social, legal, and religious institution. They gave transaction records sanctity and an authority that eventually trickled down into the broader society, seeding the concept that paper, or clay tablet, proof was crucial for all forms of exchange. It's almost poetically fitting that this pivotal step came from temples where divine order met the earthly demands of resource control, connecting heaven and market in a single, unyielding clay tablet. Next, we'll see how this astonishing system grew even more complex, moving from tokens to detailed narrative trade tablets that read like ancient receipts. Picking up from the temple economy's pivotal role, you now watch the transition from simple clay tokens, those tiny, oddly shaped bits of baked clay used to count goods, to fully developed tablets that laid out transaction details with surprising complexity. Initially, these tokens represented basic commodities, like a sheep or a jar of oil, and were sealed in clay envelopes to prevent tampering. But just imagine the frustration of having to break open an envelope every time you needed to check your goods count. No wonder the system evolved toward inscriptions directly on tablets. As you examine these developments, you see how the tokens inside the clay bulle, those sealed envelopes, began to be pressed onto soft clay surfaces as impressions. This acted like a primitive barcode, but without any electronic scanner to make life easier. Over time, this practice gave way to replacing tokens with full written descriptions in cuneiform, spelling out quantities, goods, dates, and the involved parties. Essentially, the tablets became those ancient Mesopotamian receipts, complete with all necessary transaction details. This evolution marks a huge leap from physical counting objects to abstract symbolic representation in writing. Historians still argue whether this leap happened as a top-down reform, say, by temple administrators needing clearer records, or emerged more organically as merchants and scribes sought efficient tools. Either way, it signals early bureaucratic sophistication, with growing demands for precision and accountability in a bustling economy. The increased detail on tablets transformed the transactions themselves, allowing them to include conditions like delivery dates, payment types, and even witnesses. You might think this reads like a modern contract, but it essentially had all the deal's fine print baked literally into a slab. Hence, the tablets also served a legal purpose, defending parties against disputes and fraud. After all, who wouldn't want proof when haggling over a donkey or a shipment of barley? And now for a quirky fact. In some cases, clay tablets recorded liabilities for lost or damaged goods, but also included amusingly specific clauses. In one famous example, a merchant agreed to deliver wool, but was penalized if the shipment arrived wet, say, from rain damage en route. It shows how surprisingly nuanced and practical these early contracts could be, with contingencies and conditions ordinarily relegated to modern legalese. Meanwhile, the very act of pressing tokens and later inscribing cuneiform had technical challenges. Each demand for a receipt required mastery of signs and spatial arrangement on the tablet, like fitting a tricky puzzle where one wrong wedge could alter amounts or meaning. scribal schools evolved to train experts to create error-free tablets, and these scribes were the unsung heroes, preserving economic trust. Another complex aspect appears when you discover tablets recording multi-party transactions involving barter, loans, and even penalties for late payments. These deal structures sometimes included interest rates on loans, suggesting early monetary economics at work. In fact, some clay tablets resemble little financial reports, tracking how much grain was loaned, whom it was loaned to, and when repayment was due. Rhythmically, you can imagine the scribes' styluses tapping against the soft clay, their progress slowed only by the need for precision. They weren't just accountants, they were translators between the physical world of goods and the abstract world of numbers and agreements. Their writing was the bedrock of trust, transforming trade chaos into a system of known rules and verified agreements. But the story isn't all bureaucratic humdrum. Some tablets reveal remarkably personal details. One tablet even lists a delivery of beer payable to a man named Ninkarak, presumably after the goddess of healing. So, you catch a glimpse of social interplay, commerce mixing with divine references, weaving economic life seamlessly with cultural elements. This interplay between token and tablet is critical. Tokens symbolize the physical goods. Tablets lay out the intangible promises. Together, they light a path from prehistoric exchange to documented commerce. Without this transformation, the concept of a receipt would have remained a vague notion, never quite crystallizing into a trusted, shareable record. So next time you glimpse a digital confirmation on your phone after a purchase, spare a thought for those quiet, dusty clay tablets pressed thousands of years ago. Their evolution from simple symbols to comprehensive trade documents laid the groundwork for all future economic record-keeping. You're now peeling back the layers of those early clay tablets that actually qualify as the first receipts. At a glance, they look like little rectangles of hardened mud, but as you lean in, you begin to decode their stories, scribbled in wedge-shaped cuneiform that tells you who owned what, when, and how much. These tablets are the original proof of purchase, mixed with a touch of ancient contract law, all baked under the sun. Most of these receipts document transactions involving foodstuffs, livestock, or labor payments. For example, one tablet might record that Enlil Kuduri Usur delivered 20 measures of barley to a temple storehouse on a specific date. With these clear markers, you understand that these weren't casual shopping notes, but formal records intended to verify and enforce agreements. Think of them as your ancient grocery receipts. Only instead of "thank you for shopping at Walmart," they state "received by temple steward, Enlil Nasir, sealed and recorded." Historians still argue whether these tablets were always generated at the moment of transaction or sometimes produced as summary records after the fact. The exact purpose might have varied between one-off trades and bureaucratic accounting within large temples or palace administrations. But one thing certain, these were official documents, not just scribbled reminders. Now, for something a bit surprising, some of these receipts contained not just lists of goods, but tiny drawings or even stamped seals from officials that validated the deal. Imagine if your grocery receipt came with a personalized stamp from the cashier's boss. That's the equivalent level of authority and accountability in play. These seals were often intricately carved cylinder seals, rolled onto the clay to leave a signature, much like a modern ink stamp, serving as an anti-forgery measure. Without the seal, the tablet's authenticity might be questioned. From a more fringe perspective, some scholars believe that certain documented transactions recorded magical or ritual payments disguised as economic exchanges. For example, a receipt might list a payment for divine purification, which could be read either as a genuine financial transaction or a euphemism cloaking religious offerings. It's a little like sorting out whether your receipt for spa services was a day of rest or just code for get out of jail free. This ambiguity fascinates historians because it hints at how intertwined religion and commerce were. Even the receipts carried that ambiguity. Interestingly, the tablets show different formats depending on their function. Some resemble detailed invoices, listing item quantities, quality grades, and even delivery schedules. Others look like promissory notes, where the borrower promises to repay goods or labor at a future date. This diversity implies a surprisingly flexible and sophisticated economic language, tailored to different transactional needs. Far from being rigid, these fragments were forms of tailored communication. You also get a premonition of that ubiquitous legal fine print critique when the tablets contain clauses outlining penalties for late payment or damaged goods, much like the late fee notes plastered on your modern bills. One tablet, for example, specifies that an additional measure of grain must be paid as a penalty if payment is received later than agreed. It's kind of like your electricity company saying, pay on time or we'll charge you extra. Except here, it's barley and goats instead of kilowatt hours and dollars. The language used in the receipts also evolves as you probe deeper. The tablets often use passive constructions that emphasize the object, the goods received, rather than the actors involved. This suggests that in Mesopotamian society, the transaction itself, sealed and recorded, carried more weight than the personal identity of those conducting it. Kind of what matters is that I got my barley, not who handed it over. Your fingertips can almost feel the flat, sun-baked surface of tablets where these records were etched. The plasticity of clay allowed scribes to correct mistakes by smoothing over the wet surface and rewriting, an early undo button before ink and pen or digital backups of your work. Yet, once dried and fired, these tablets became indelible proof, immune to second-guessing, essentially saying, "This is it, friends, no returns, no do-overs." One might marvel that while we take electronic records for granted, these clay tablets were remarkably durable, outlasting the fragile papyrus or early parchment, hence their prevalence among archaeological finds. Sometimes it seems the materiality of receipts had as much to do with preservation as the content itself. Some tablets even record the delivery of surprisingly specific goods, like textiles dyed a particular shade or livestock with distinct characteristics. You get a sense of a marketplace with quality control and product branding far earlier than you thought possible. Imagine a merchant guaranteeing this wool is the softest from the far hills, ancient customer satisfaction claims in clay form. If you reflect on the tablet as an artifact, you realize it was also a communication tool to future parties, auditors, temple officials, or even the courts. The tablet testified on behalf of the parties when disputes arose, a kind of ancient version of no receipt, no refund, Historians still argue whether these tablets were originally intended more for internal bureaucracy or for settling external legal disputes, but likely they served both roles. And just as you might be multitasking, checking your phone, sipping tea, and nodding off, the scribes carved multiple layers of information on a single tablet: the transaction, its legal context, and a timestamp. These tablets acted as all-in-one documents, blending record-keeping, contract enforcement, and administrative order. We modern humans could learn a thing or two about efficiency. So, behind their unassuming clay surfaces, these early receipts reveal a world where commerce, law, religion, and social trust were all baked together, quite literally, forming the backbone of complex economic life in ancient Mesopotamia. You step into the shadowy halls where scribes sit, their styluses poised over soft tablets, guardians of memory and masters of trust. In ancient Mesopotamia, these scribes weren't just pencil pushers, they were the human data centers of their time, the crucial link between the chaotic swirl of marketplace dealings and the orderly recording that transformed barter into the IOU economy. Without them, those clay tablets with receipts, contracts, and lists would remain indecipherable messes or disappear entirely from the historical record. At the center of every recorded receipt, you'll find the imprint of a scribe's hand, both literally and figuratively. Scribes were typically educated in temple or palace schools, trained extensively in cuneiform script, a notoriously difficult writing system with hundreds of different signs for sounds, words, and quantities. Imagine memorizing a whole alphabet, numerals, and vocabulary without a single app to quiz you. Because literacy was such a rare, specialized skill, scribes yielded immense social power. They were trusted with sensitive information, financial records, property deeds, legal documents, and sometimes acted as witnesses or advisors. Historians still argue whether scribes were merely clerks or if they sometimes played more substantive roles, like strategists or negotiators behind the scenes. Some evidence suggests that the line between recorder and participant was often blurred. A scribe might influence the way a transaction was recorded, sneaking in protections for one party or another. Think of them as a blend between modern accountants, lawyers, and lobbyists wrapped in ancient robes. A quirky tidbit: scribes used a calculating device made from strings of small clay tokens before mastering clay tablets, kind of like a prehistoric abacus. These tokens were shaped like spheres, cones, or discs, each representing a different commodity or quantity. Before writing, these tokens were physically collected to count livestock, grain, or oil jars. This physical system morphed seamlessly into the idea of inscribing numbers and items on tablets. Talk about putting your math skills in writing. The scribe's tools were deceptively simple: a pointed reed stylus and soft clay, but wielded with tremendous finesse. Different stylus angles created distinctive wedge shapes, making cuneiform both an art and a science. Some tablets even show corrections where scribes carefully scraped off errors and rewrote, almost like whiteout today. This reveals the pressure to get the record perfectly accurate, as mistakes could lead to mistrust or legal trouble. They often worked within temple complexes, but scribes also found roles in royal courts, merchant households, and even as freelancers offering accounting services. So, Scribes weren't some isolated caste. Their work embedded them deep within every rung of society that depended on economic transactions. Yet, peculiarly, women rarely appear among the ranks of professional scribes, although some evidence hints they occasionally learn the craft, especially in merchant families. Gender roles in ancient Mesopotamian literacy remain a fascinating yet contentious scholarly issue. One detail that always tickles curiosity is that some scribes signed their work with personal marks, almost like graffiti artists. A tablet might say, "Written by Ishbi Era, son of Lamar," giving you a glimpse of the individual behind the otherwise anonymous ledger entries. It adds this human warmth. These marks say, "Here I was accounting for barley." Some tablets even boast about the scribe's skills, or tell you not to tamper with the record under penalty. Imagine that on your next receipt. Authorized by Bob the Great, who demands a coffee if you question this invoice. Despite their importance, scribes had complex social standings. They were respected but not elite, more like high-tier civil servants. Their education took years and significant effort, but they rarely amassed wealth directly from their work. Much like modern freelance accountants who handle other people's money but don't get to retire on it, yet their role was essential to the trust microcosm, enabling complex economies to flourish. An amusing fringe theory floating among some scholars is that scribes might have had secret club memberships, using their knowledge of cuneiform and contracts to influence power dynamics in the city-states. Could this be an ancient old boys club altering records in secret? Though this remains speculative and hotly debated, it's tempting to imagine cloak and dagger intrigue hidden among the stacks of tablets in scribal archives. It's also intriguing how scribes helped standardize weights and measures, crucial for the reliability of receipts. After all, a sure kilogram equals a kilogram across different merchants and temples. Without scribes and their painstaking records, trade disputes would spiral into chaos, probably more dramatic than the ancient soap operas of palace intrigue. Some tablets even record subtle differences in measuring systems changing over time, hinting at efforts to unify standards as city-states interacted more. Remember the cylinder seals from earlier receipts? Scribes often interacted closely with sealers, the specialists who physically imprinted these official marks on contract tablets. Sometimes the scribe and sealer were the same person, increasing efficiency and trust. This interplay of roles strengthened the document's authority, reducing the chances of fraud. Finally, scribes played a crucial role in preserving knowledge across generations. Their tablets not only recorded daily transactions, but also held myths, laws, and literature. The famous epic of Gilgamesh, for example, comes to us through the hands of scribes who considered storytelling a parallel extension of their duties. So, your receipt from the temple storehouse shares the same medium and cultural lineage as poetry and law. So next time you toss out a crumpled receipt, spare a thought for the ancient scribes, clay stylus in hand, painstakingly printing wedges that told stories of trade, trust, and the very fabric of ancient society. Without them, the silent clay would remain just mud. But thanks to their craft, those early receipts become windows into the economic and social lives of humanity's first civilizations. You see, receipts weren't just dry records of sales or trades. They functioned like the Swiss Army knives of the ancient economic and social toolkit. Step beyond the bustling markets and grand temple courtyards, and you'll find these clay tablets weaving their way into every corner of daily life, tracking everything from loans to rations to labor services. It's like having the world's first multi-purpose planner, but inscribed in wedge-shaped script on rock-hard clay. Honestly, it's a marvel they didn't invent the ancients' version of sticky notes. Let's start with loans. In ancient Mesopotamia, borrowing grain, silver, or livestock wasn't unusual, mostly because farmers could be unpredictable, with harvests often at nature's mercy. Receipts documenting loans were vital to keep everyone honest. Imagine a receipt that states, Person A borrows 30 bushels of barley, due at next harvest with a 1/5 interest. Forget Google Calendar reminders. These dusty slab reminders serve to protect both lender and borrower against the fuzzy memories of seasonal toil. Interestingly, some tablets reveal what you might call early payday loans, complete with absurdly high interest rates. Talk about ancient financial stress. Historians still argue whether some loan tablets crossed the line from simple documentation into a form of early credit contracts with legally enforceable penalties for default. The wrinkle in this debate is that enforcement mechanisms were less standardized than today, often relying on social pressure or local authority rather than a central bank. So, the receipt was as much about social accountability as legal proof. Next, take rations, a key social aspect, especially within temples, palaces, and military camps. Ration receipts detailed who received food, when, and how much. The sheer bureaucratic complexity here is staggering. Workers building ziggurats or soldiers on campaign were regularly accounted for through these transaction slabs. To you, a modern paycheck might feel mundane, but for a laborer receiving barley or oil as a wage recorded on cuneiform tablets, that was the ultimate proof of employment. A quirky ancient practice popped up here. Sometimes receipts reveal that specific workers received special rations like beer as part of their compensation, a reward for a hard day's work, or maybe a clever way to encourage productivity. Imagine your pay stub noting a bonus pint of beer. Now that would be motivation. In fact, the famous beer receipts proved such a staple that they sparked ongoing debates about whether Mesopotamian pubs extended credit based on these tablet records. Labor went beyond daily wages too. Some receipts recorded obligations like 6 days of plowing fields or 2 months of temple cleaning service. It's a fascinating glimpse into a society where personal labor and communal duties were extensively monitored. The receipt thus was not just a financial tool, but a social contract binding individuals to obligations beyond mere currency exchanges. Remember, too, the temple economy's substantial role. Temples functioned as giant landlords and employers, managing property, producing goods, and distributing rations. Receipts certified these interactions, ensuring that the temple's vast network of workers, tenants, and suppliers left a clear paper trail, or should we say clay trail. This was crucial in preventing disputes, as temples held immense spiritual and economic power, and receipts backed that. The temper of these tablets could be surprisingly candid. One amusing example hints at a scribe grumbling in the margins about a barley delivery being of inferior quality, echoing the tone of a particularly dissatisfied Yelp review, but 4,000 years old. You begin to see that these receipts weren't sterile data. they occasionally reveal the personalities and conditions underlying the transactions. On a quirkier note, some receipts describe the labor of specialized weavers, silversmiths, and even musicians. Not everyone was trading barley or livestock. There was a flourishing marketplace for skills and crafts, neatly recorded on receipts. It invites us to reconsider how complex these early economies were, with social roles interconnected through invisible threads of documentation. Receipts also served familial functions. Some tablets track inheritances or dowry transactions, capturing agreements and transfers within families, precursors to wills and marriage contracts. They allowed ancient families to document property and obligations, crucial in societies where oral traditions could otherwise blur essential agreements. Historians still argue about how legally binding these family receipts were, but their existence affirms the importance of written proof in personal affairs. A fun fact: an excavated receipt once recorded the delivery of 20 sheep, while noting that 2 were too sick to eat. Imagine the ancient equivalent of a grocery complaint form. It's a reminder that life's little annoyances and petty grievances are nothing new. They just used a stylus and clay instead of emails. And yes, sheep health warrants official mention. Beyond immediate livelihood, some reports show receipt tablets tying into religious offerings or temple donations. Donors' contributions were meticulously logged, effectively serving as divine receipts, a way to record piety and generosity, as if to say, "I gave this to the gods, don't forget it, heaven." This intertwining of faith and finance adds a profound dimension to how receipts functioned as trusted records across earthly and spiritual realms. Of course, all these receipts tie back to a fragile balance of trust. With limited literacy among common folk, the presence of a scribe and a written record elevated the transaction's reliability. Receipts mediated between memory and obligation as tangible proof that you owed grain, labor, or silver. Without this mediation, trade and society would slip into chaos. So, as you ponder these ancient clay slips, imagine the ripple effects: an early farmer proving he repaid his loan, a temple worker ensuring his rations, a craftsman documenting his service. The humble receipt was the beating heart of administrative precision, a quiet star of social order in the whirlwind of Mesopotamian life. Now, let's turn to a question that still fascinates scholars and invites lively debate. What legal force did receipts actually carry in ancient Mesopotamian society? One might think that a document scratched into clay wouldn't hold much sway, but these humble tablets often stood as the backbone of legal and economic security, at least in theory. Historians still argue whether all receipts functioned as binding contracts enforceable by courts, or whether some were purely administrative memos, more reminders than hard evidence. Picture yourself stepping into a Mesopotamian court. Imagine stone walls crowded with sun-bleached citizens arguing over debts, property disputes, or marriage agreements. In this setting, your receipt tablet might be your lifeline. Courts increasingly relied on written documentation to mediate conflicts, so a well-preserved receipt could make the difference between justice and injustice. This evolving legal reliance on written proof transformed the economic landscape. Instead of relying solely on oral testimony or shaky memories, legal officials accepted clay records as credible evidence. Interestingly, the roles of witness and scribe sometimes blurred. As you'd expect, the more eyes and signatures, or cylinder seals, a receipt bore, the stronger its legal standing. Cylinder seals, those tiny engraved stones rolled over wet clay, acted like ancient signatures or stamps of authenticity. A receipt bearing an official seal wasn't just a note, it was a declaration under oath. In fact, losing your tablet or its seal could be tantamount to losing your claim, showing how physically anchoring a document gave it legal heft. But here's the spicy bit. Some scholars suggest the idea of receipts as enforceable contracts varies between city-states and over time. For instance, in Old Babylonian law, tablets with receipt-like content appeared to be accepted as evidence in disputes, but elsewhere, oral agreements still held substantial weight. It's a murky middle ground where the writing system was powerful but hadn't elbowed out all traditional forms of proof. Think of it like the transition from email to text messages today, different channels coexisting unevenly. Another fascinating angle is how the very language on receipt tablets incorporates legal phrases, terms like payment fulfilled, guaranteed, or in accordance with the law. Some tablets use guzanu, a word indicating a formal document, implying that certain receipts minted their own legal force, rather like how a notarized receipt today carries more legitimacy. Whether these conventions represented enforceable rights or merely recognized customs, they reveal a growing sophistication in ancient legal culture. On the flip side, there were also quasi-receipts, documents that approximated receipt functions but didn't guarantee full legal status. A merchant might record an informal acknowledgement of delivery without the official stamp or witness confirmation, which would leave the record vulnerable in court. It's akin to handing over goods with a shrug and a handshake, then realizing later you have zero proof. Historians still debate how widespread and effective these less official receipts truly were. The emergence of court cases involving receipts invites us to imagine the human dramas underpinning these clay records. Stories survive of merchants suing over unpaid debts, farmers contesting who returned seed grain, or heirs disputing summations of family property, all hinging on tiny slabs of soft clay, left to harden into small monuments of conflict and resolution. It's a vivid reminder that receipts weren't just economic tools. They shaped social justice. There's also a social layer dimension. Elites and wealthy traders were more likely to use official receipts with full legal backing, while small farmers or artisans might rely on informal notes or verbal agreements. This layered reception points to economic inequality underpinning access to written legal recourse, a reminder that even thousands of years ago, paperwork had its bureaucratic gatekeepers. And let's not overlook the enforcement side of the equation. If a debtor defaulted, despite receipt of evidence, consequences might include land seizure, forced labor, or social disgrace. Authoritarian rulers sometimes leveraged these receipts for tax collection and debt enforcement, blurring the lines between finance, law, and political control. In some cases, temple officials might serve as judges, balancing commercial and religious interests, a dual role barely believable in modern secular courts. Amusingly, some tablets record absurd disputes that seem to echo workplace complaints. A laborer officially contests the amount of barley paid, or a merchant alleges damaged goods. It's tempting to see these as office politics circa 2000 BCE, reminding you that quarrels over contracts have always had a human face. A curious fringe theory posits that some receipts could have functioned as early credit instruments transferable between parties, like negotiable notes, though concrete proof is lacking. If true, that would foreshadow sophisticated financial instruments millennia before the first banknotes. Historians still argue the extent of this credit transfer ability, but it reveals how the humble receipt might have harbored seeds of financial innovation. To sum up, the legal power of receipts in ancient Mesopotamia was genuine but nuanced, a mix of formal authority and evolving practice. They were more than mere reminders. They became essential currency of trust and justice, threading through the complex weave of law, economy, and society. The next time you see your cluttered desk or your emailed receipt, imagine it as a descendant of these ancient clay tablets, a tiny but mighty symbol of accountability and trust, carved deep into the annals of human civilization. As we shift our gaze beyond Mesopotamia, a fascinating panorama of contemporaneous record-keeping and receipt-like practices unfolds in ancient Egypt and the Indus Valley, revealing a world where commerce and administration thrived in parallel yet distinct ways. You might picture traders navigating the Nile's gentle currents, or merchants bustling amidst the orderly streets of Mohenjo-Daro, each culture crafting unique systems to document their economic lives. Ancient Egypt's approach centered heavily on papyrus scrolls, a lightweight portable medium far removed from the heavy, durable clay tablets of Mesopotamia. Imagine papyrus scribes in bustling marketplaces, recording grain deliveries, labor rations, and tax collections with reed brushes dipped in ink. These scrolls, while more perishable, relied on the relative scarcity and value of papyrus itself to protect their contents, a curious trade-off between durability and convenience. Interestingly, historians still argue whether Egyptian tax receipt records, often marked with elaborate hieroglyphics and official stamps, carried the same legal binding status as Mesopotamian clay documents. Unlike the wedge-shaped script, Egyptian hieroglyphs leaned heavily on symbolic imagery and religious iconography, sometimes blurring the lines between administrative record and spiritual offering, a kind of sacred bookkeeping where gods and taxes intersected. The scribes' dual role as bureaucrats and religious functionaries added a layer of solemnity to their work. Crossing further east, the enigmatic Indus Valley civilization, flourishing around the same time, left behind an intriguing but still undeciphered script on small seals and tablets. Though no one has conclusively cracked their writing, archaeological finds suggest they, too, developed systems for tracking commerce and exchanges, possibly using compact, standardized seals that worked like trademarks or receipts to indicate ownership or transaction completion. It's as if each trader carried a personal logo to mark goods, ensuring authenticity in increasingly complex trade networks. Quirky evidence from the Indus region includes miniature clay bullae, tiny hollow spheres stamped with symbols and containing tokens inside, likely serving a function very similar to Mesopotamian tokens and receipts by securely packaging transaction information. Historians still debate their precise usage, but these babushka-like devices illustrate a creativity in record-keeping parallel, but distinct from their Mesopotamian neighbors. While Egyptian papyri could rapidly decay in the hot climate, Indus artifacts benefited from burial in the dry Indus plain, granting us a tantalizing peek into their economic life. Unlike Egypt's often centralized state economies, the Indus Valley seemed to favor more autonomous, guild-like trading communities. Their receipts may have thus reflected negotiation between equals more than hierarchical tax collection. One fascinating contrast is in the material culture, where Mesopotamian receipts were often bulky slabs or tokens. Egyptian records came in lightweight bundles, and Indus artifacts were compact stamps and seals. It's almost as if you can imagine a merchant's toolkit varying with geography and social structure, like the difference between wielding a hammer, a pen, or a smartphone app today. In ancient Egypt, specific tax receipt fragments were sometimes inscribed on ostraca, pottery shards used as a cheap and practical scribbling surface. Imagine the scribes hastily jotting down receipts on broken potsherds to avoid wasting precious papyrus. This mundane economy of recycling pottery for receipts hints at the day-to-day realities behind those grand pyramids. Not everything was carved into stone or painted on temple walls. About the legal implications, Egyptian receipts frequently bore seals from officials symbolizing royal authority, but debates persist about how enforceable a tax receipt was in disputes, since many records seem more administrative than contractual. Could you imagine a farmer disputing the amount of grain delivered with nothing but a frayed papyrus fragment in hand? Historians still puzzle over the extent to which the Egyptian bureaucracy formalized dispute resolution. Meanwhile, the Indus Valley's still mysterious script keeps scholars guessing. Some fringe theories propose that the symbols on seals functioned almost like barcodes encoding all transaction details, but with no Rosetta Stone analog. This remains speculative at best. Yet, the presence of standardized weights and measuring devices nearby suggests a sophisticated economy underpinning those markings. An amusing tidbit involves one set of Indus seals bearing images of animals like unicorns, mythical ones, not glittery ponies, used presumably to represent city-states or guilds, almost like a medieval coat of arms or a hipster company logo. It begs the question, if they had receipts with unicorns stamped on them, did merchants take greater pride in their invoices? It seems clear that while Mesopotamian receipts became legal documents, Egyptian and Indus counterparts were more intertwined with administrative control, religious symbolism, or trade identity, flagging diverse cultural attitudes to the notion of proof in commerce. This diversity forces us to appreciate that receipts, beyond being mere paper or clay, bear the cultural fingerprints of their societies. By contrasting these ancient giants, you start to appreciate the human impulse to document and assure transactions, something universally vital, yet endlessly varied. Whether chiseled into stone, painted on fragile scrolls, or stamped into seals, receipts anchored trust in human exchange. When you next glance at your glossy printed receipt or that digital ping on your phone, remember it's part of a global dialogue that stretches millennia and continents. Receipts and taxation. Now, there's an ancient power couple that shaped economies and empires long before tax season filled your email inbox with reminders. Imagine local officials standing in the scattered shadows of ziggurats or palatial courtyards, counting sacks of grain or cataloging prized cattle, each exchange meticulously logged to satisfy a distant ruler who rarely left the capital. Taxes weren't mere annoyances. They were the bloodstream of statecraft, and receipts, those humble slips and tablets, were the postmarks of accountability. In Mesopotamia, taxation and receipts were inseparable, a symbiotic duo that kept the wheels of empire turning. As cities shifted from tribal clusters to complex urban centers, rulers demanded a reliable record system to extract necessary resources, grain, livestock, labor, from subjects. The idea of receiving your tax payment was backed by clay tablets recording every transaction, sometimes sealed by officials and stored painstakingly in temple archives. These receipts didn't just confirm payment, they were legal shields, proof that citizens fulfilled their obligations, averting potential penalties or social disgrace. It's fascinating to note that some tax receipts doubled as redistributive tools. Temples, often functioning as economic nodes themselves, recorded offerings in stone or clay receipts, later dispersing rations or goods to workers and priests. The system was an early welfare state. If your taxes were paid, your receipt might grant access to food or labor allotments during tough seasons. Historians still argue whether this practice was more a religious duty or a pragmatic administration, but it surely blurred the line between church, state, and economics. Now, shift to ancient Egypt, where taxation was an intricate affair involving the pharaoh's officials roaming fertile fields and Nile-adjacent towns. Tax payments might come in grain, livestock, or even labor, and papyrus receipts bore hieroglyphic stamps certifying compliance. Since Egypt's political system was a divine kingship, those receipts also reverberated with spiritual authority. Paying taxes was not just a civic duty, but a holy obligation, intertwining religion with public administration. A quirky, shorter tidbit: some Egyptian tax receipts contain scribbled notations of beer deliveries to workers. Yes, beer was a currency unto itself, a reminder that ancient workers probably enjoyed a cold one after a day hauling mud bricks. You could say, pay your taxes, get your brew, the earliest happy hour documented. The Indus Valley, meanwhile, presents a puzzle. Their undeciphered inscriptions and compact sealed tokens hint at some form of taxation, but since we haven't unlocked their script, much remains speculative. Historians still debate whether those sealed pieces represented tax records, trade receipts, or property claims, but the discovery of standardized weights and uniform seals strongly suggests a systematic, possibly state-driven economic oversight. Interestingly, the concept of receipts as evidence of taxation introduced complex legal needs. Were taxpayers able to contest their assessments using these records, or did the ruling class wield them solely as instruments of control? In Mesopotamia, there is evidence of legal disputes referenced in clay tablet receipts, indicating that these documents helped settle arguments. This early form of proof of payment likely protected commoners from arbitrary double taxation or confiscation. On the other hand, in Egypt, the divine status of the pharaoh made disputes trickier. A tax receipt bore not just legal but spiritual weight, and refusing payment could be seen as both political rebellion and sacrilege. This heightened the stakes for those scribes scratching receipts onto fragile papyrus. One wonders if any ambitious scribes ever slipped a frown or sarcastic comment into the margins. Too bad no ancient TikTok to document it. Now, consider the practicalities. Tax receipts also provided valuable population data, for example, recording who owed what and who was exempt. This allowed emerging state bureaucracies to plan food distribution, conscription, and public works. So your humble receipt was part census, part tax filing, part social contract. One intriguing debate surrounds the audit culture of early states. Archaeologists have uncovered accounting houses attached to temples in Mesopotamia, where teams of scribes continually updated records, cross-referencing receipts and inventories. This tight bookkeeping suggests rulers understood that precise records encourage compliance and minimize corruption, a lesson modern tax agencies still attempt to grasp. And while the system sounds a bit like a bureaucratic nightmare today, there was an element of trust, too. Taxes and receipts forged an explicit promise. Pay what you owe, get access to services, protection, or grain when famine struck. A ticket to citizenship, if you will, even if it was stamped in mud or scrawled on fragile reed scrolls. A fringe yet charmingly human aspect. Some receipts involved tax bribes or favors to evade full payments. Ancient cuneiform letters hint that messengers sometimes smuggled under the table gifts along with clay tablets to smooth over disputes. The line between official receipts and shady dealings was blurrier than your last email inbox after ignoring notifications. Historians still argue about how widespread such practices were, but the universality of human creativity in tax avoidance is hearteningly relatable. Emperors and officials surely thrived on the data stored in receipts, tracking not only wealth, but political loyalty. Refusing to pay or furnish records might signal rebellion, while meticulous receipt-keeping demonstrated allegiance. One could imagine local governors eyeing their archives, pondering how many farmers were likely to grumble silently but pay up anyway. As economies grew, so did the complexity of tax receipts. Some tablets detailed multiple transactions for land, livestock, and labor tax in one go, like ancient form fillers juggling multiple categories. The scribes writing these were the unsung back-end workers of the empire, ensuring every grain accounted for. You can almost hear their sighs as they balanced equations in clay, quieter than modern accountants but equally crucial. In sum, receipts weren't just scraps of paper or clay, they embodied the delicate dance of power, trust, religion, and economics in early civilizations. Whether swept away in floods, burned in fires, or dug up millennia later, these tablets and scrolls shout across time, "You paid your dues, and here's the proof." So next time your phone buzzes with an electronic receipt, know you're participating in an ancient tradition of accountability, one where your ancestors probably grunted over much messier records. Quirky receipt finds. If you think your weekly grocery receipt is strange because it lists a suspicious number of snack foods, imagine uncovering a clay tablet detailing how many donkeys you sold for beer, or a cuneiform note scribbled hastily after a shipment of fish spoiled in transit. The ancient world really knew how to keep things interesting. Throughout Mesopotamia and other early civilizations, receipts captured more than dry financial data. They preserved small, often whimsical snapshots of everyday life. Take, for example, a tablet discovered in the ruins of Uruk that meticulously records the delivery of 50 jars of date syrup, followed by a casually added note that half were accidentally spilled by the goat herder. It's like an ancient version of customer service complaints tucked in alongside formal payments. Historians still argue whether such notations were standard practice or a quirky scribe's personal touch, but these details bring heady bureaucracy to a relatable human level. Another enlightening find is a tax receipt that was essentially a thank you note for delivering beer to temple workers. Beer, you see, wasn't merely a leisure beverage, but a staple of Mesopotamian diets and a form of currency. The tablet notes 20 jars of beer sent to laborers and priests during festival preparations. The idea that beer was logged alongside grain and silver as official business will either make you chuckle or rethink your Friday night plans. Perhaps most charming were the receipts concerning livestock sales or trade. One particularly famous tablet lists donkeys, sheep, and even a camel, specifying each animal's condition and sometimes the personality quirks of the seller. Well, if carved in wedge-shaped characters counts as quirks. These receipts show that even 4,000 years ago, sellers had to vouch for the quality of their wares, a tradition that endures today when you try to return defective electronics or gym memberships. Oddly enough, some tablets reveal surprisingly informal exchanges. A receipt found in Nippur records the loan of a hen and an agreement that instead of repayment with silver, the borrower would deliver eggs. The creative barter system reflected flexibility in transaction records. Historians still argue whether such exchanges were widespread or localized quirks, but these examples underscore that not all receipts were one-size-fits-all. Lost in some dusty temple archive was a tablet listing a shipment of smelly fish delivered to workers in Ur. The scribe notes the price paid, but adds with palpable disdain, stench unbearable. This not only humanizes the ancient record-keeping, but also suggests that even back then, quality control had a place in receipts, not to mention it might have been the earliest documented food complaint, better than today's Yelp reviews, if you ask me. Some ancient scribes also embedded reminders or warnings. For instance, in Mari, a tablet warns that failing to make timely repayments on loans documented in receipts would result in public shame or loss of property. This reveals how receipts functioned as social contracts, not just simple records. The looming threat of dishonor or legal consequences was baked right into these transactions, a bit harsher than our modern overdue notices, but equally effective. A fringe but fascinating touch is the occasional incorporation of receipt prayers, where a religious blessing would be inscribed on certain tablets to invoke divine witness to the transaction. Some Mesopotamian receipts end with curses against anyone who might attempt to tamper with the record or cheat the system. Historians still debate whether these were serious spiritual threats or just scribes flexing their rhetorical muscles to deter fraud. Receipt humor isn't entirely lost to time either. There's a notorious tablet where a scribe seemingly complains, "The draft ox was too stubborn in a farming service contract," adding that the owner should train the beast better next time. While most receipts stay neutral and objective, this one hints at scribes slipping in voice and personality, reminding us they were human, maybe a bit amused or frustrated by their daily monotony. You might wonder, did any of these scribes ever toss in doodles? Archaeologists have found tablets with crude sketches alongside entries, probably not the Mesopotamian equivalent of posted smiley faces, but enough to suggest scribes occasionally illustrated animals or products. It's a quirky reminder that even in ancient bureaucracy, creativity could sneak through the cracks. Alongside financial and political receipts, cemeteries revealed burial goods accompanied by tags or ownership receipts, sometimes implying paid funerary services or guarantees regarding goods buried to accompany the dead. This shows receipts extending beyond economics into more personal, ritualistic domains. Whether these records were requested by families or mandated by priests is something historians still debate. In the Egyptian realm, papyrus receipts detailed the rations of beer, bread, and onions allocated to workers building pyramids. One cheeky note scrawled on a receipt jokingly complains about less beer this month than last, a bold move in a pharaoh's bureaucracy, if you ask me. It's as if a worker dared the scribe to risk getting fired over an after-hours joke. You begin to sense that no matter the millennium, trickles of humor and humanity found their place in official records. The Indus Valley, somewhat of a mystery given its undeciphered script, reveals intricate seals thought to relate to receipt functions for goods. Some archaeologists speculate these seals might have encoded not just merchant identity, but also payment details and delivery times. Historians still argue heavily over these interpretations, but the complexity hints at a sophisticated receipt-like system embedded in the trade. What can all these quirky finds teach us? Beyond the dry ledger facts, receipts show how civilizations wrestled with trust, communication, accountability, and even a touch of humor. They were more than receipts. They were narratives, social contracts, and snapshots of lives lived thousands of years ago. So the next time you grumble about receipts cluttering your wallet, remember they're part of a quirky and venerable tradition dating back to when goats got blamed for spilling sweet date syrup. Preservation of clay tablets. Imagine hundreds of fragile clay tablets piled up like ancient paperwork, surviving millennia in deserts, temples, and forgotten storerooms. You might think these soft clay slips would long have crumbled into dust, yet many have weathered the storms, fires, and floods of history to offer us direct access to ancient commerce and everyday life. The miracle of preservation often began unintentionally. When clay tablets were dry, they were somewhat durable but still vulnerable to damage. To better preserve important records, especially receipts, scribes sometimes fired them in kilns, essentially baking clay into durable ceramics. These fired tablets resist moisture and decay far better than unbaked ones. But the fortunate survival of many tablets is largely accidental. When cities like Nineveh or burned due to warfare or natural blazes, often these fires vitrified the tablets, hardening their surfaces and sealing the cuneiform script in place. So in a twist of fate, destruction became preservation. Historians still argue about how widespread intentional firing was versus accidental preservation from conflagrations. Some tablets seem deliberately hardened for posterity, while many more were only baked by fires beyond human control. In either case, the desert environment played its own preservation role. Arid conditions, limited mold, decay, and microbial damage that would otherwise swiftly consume organic records. This dry climate contrasted sharply with, say, the river valleys of Egypt, where papyrus was the favored medium but required frequent replacement and rarely survived beyond centuries. Interestingly, this preservation quirk led to a biased archive. What we have are often official or temple records, receipts, accounts, contracts, deposited in archives or storerooms. Everyday receipts made of perishable materials simply vanished. Imagine how many lost receipts there are, your ancient equivalent of a crumpled grocery list gone forever. Another preservation surprise comes from accidental breakages that form puzzle-like shards called ostraka. These pottery fragments were often repurposed for draft notes or quick receipts. Archaeologists painstakingly piece together these broken shards, hoping to glimpse informal transactions or scribbled reminders. Historians still debate how much informal accounting these fragments represent versus formal bookkeeping. The fragments' scattered nature challenges reconstruction, but tantalizes with glimpses into daily scribal life. A quirky preservation fact involves the curse tablets found in some Mesopotamian archives. While initially seeming eerie, some tablets contain curses aimed at thieves or those who falsify receipts. These too survived because they were baked harder for durability or preserved unwittingly in temple ruins. Such tablets remind us that receipts could be instruments of legal and spiritual threat, so maximum durability was paramount. In fact, sometimes the handwriting or cuneiform impressions outlive the tablet's physical shape. Erosion and weathering blurred or chipped surface details, forcing modern scholars to develop imaging techniques, from infrared photography to 3D scanning, to reconstruct faded texts. These technologies have revolutionized the study of ancient receipts, making inscriptions easier to read without risking damage through a physical handling. The discovery sites themselves, rubble piles from collapsed archives or temple storerooms stuffed in walls, have been treasure troves of preserved receipts. The famous royal archive of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, though largely royal correspondence, also yielded many economic receipts and accounting records, because scribes tucked these documents into storage alongside letters. Such fortuitous finds show how receipts became formalized through administrative centralization, and the archives that preserved them became accidental time capsules. Sometimes preservation hinged on seemingly mundane building decisions. Walls constructed with baked bricks or mud bricks incorporated receipts, sealed inside as foundation deposits. These might include receipts documenting material purchases or paid labor for the building itself, ancient paper trails locked inside the architecture. Researchers debate how intentionally these receipts were placed, ritualistic offerings or mere storage expediency. Still, such finds suggest that the concept of recording transactions extended even into construction projects. The clay's composition also mattered. Tablets made from fine silt clays baked hard lasted longest, while those from softer, more porous clay crumbled quickly. Archaeologists use clay analysis not just to understand preservation conditions, but to trace trade routes, since clay sources can be geographically identified, revealing economic connections. Somewhat paradoxically, the sheer volume of receipts discovered can also complicate preservation. The thousands of tablets chest deep in ancient libraries strain conservation efforts. Museums and researchers constantly battle environmental factors, humidity, temperature fluctuations, handling damage, to stabilize their collections for future study. Advances in digital cataloging and storage ensure that even if physical tablets suffer degradation, their textual content remains accessible. For all their endurance, many tablets remain fragmented or incomplete, meaning historians and linguists often work with partial records, filling gaps using context or comparison. This partiality injects uncertainty into interpreting ancient receipts. Historians still argue about the accuracy and completeness of preserved documents, cautioning that our current knowledge reflects a fragmentary glimpse in rarer climates, such as Egypt's dry desert sands. Papyri, another ancient receipt medium, have been preserved, but these organic materials require different conservation techniques. Egypt offers receipts on papyrus, typically for rations or land records, preserved in tombs or desert graves, sometimes remarkably intact because of burial conditions. These contrast with Mesopotamian clay tablets, yet offer comparable economic insights. Finally, a charming note on the discovery process. Early archaeologists sometimes mistook receipt tablets for mundane debris, unaware of their significance. Many of these boring clay slabs were catalogued en masse, with intricate receipt-related details overlooked at first. Modern advances and a focus on ancient economic history have transformed receipts from dusty dullness into vital keys unlocking how ancient societies functioned and communicated. So, next time you swipe a digital receipt or print from a cashier, remember that the durability of your transaction proof owes a lot to hundreds or thousands of years of clay tablets, burned in fires, dug from deserts, and painstakingly preserved by nature's quirks and human care. Receiving a receipt today connects you directly to that vast legacy of trust, recording, and occasional goat spill complaints. The decline and transformation of receipt practices, and now that you're holding on to the legacy of those ancient cuneiform tablets baked by fires and tucked behind temple walls, it's time to watch how the story of receipts shifts and morphs through the ages. You might think once civilization grew, receipts would only get more sophisticated and consistent, but history loves a good curveball. As societies changed, so too did the necessity, form, and even the existence of physical proofs of transactions. Post-Mesopotamia, the rise and fall of empires, new technologies, and shifting economic models led to transformations in how receipts were handled, or in some cases, overlooked entirely. With the fall of the great Mesopotamian city-states, centralized bureaucracies weakened. This fragmented, empire-level record-keeping pushed accounting back toward localized, less formal methods. Historians still argue whether this decentralization erased continuity in receipt usage or merely morphed it into alternative administrative expressions. Enter the classical world, where ancient Rome and Greece added their own spin. You'd expect grand marble archways and gladiator fights, but also surprisingly mundane receipts for everything from grain sales to military supplies. Yet Roman receipts often took the form of wax tablets or papyrus scrolls, much lighter and more portable than those hefty clay slabs. The Romans institutionalized written contracts and receipts, some sealed with signatures or stamps to guarantee authenticity, early versions of your modern signature and receipt barcode combo. However, many transactional records were also oral or based on trust within guilds or families, meaning physical receipts weren't always the norm. When the Western Roman Empire crumbled, the chain of formal receipt-keeping saw a period of decline in some regions. Archaeological sites from the early Middle Ages often reveal far fewer surviving records, hinting at a shift away from extensive bureaucratic documentation. Still, in places like Byzantium or the Islamic caliphates, sophisticated receipt and document traditions thrived, sometimes leaning on more durable materials or even adding new security features like seals and embossing. It's like receipts went undercover, adopting spy-level measures to ensure nobody fudged the numbers. The medieval period offers another twist. The rise of merchants and trade fairs across Europe called for practical, portable receipts written in vernacular languages rather than classical Latin. Quirky examples from merchant guilds survive, showing receipts written on parchment or even scraps of reused paper. Some merchants preferred issuing handwritten letters of exchange, equivalent to modern IOUs or traveler's checks, indicating that receipts were not only legal instruments, but also financial tools with flexible forms. Historians still debate how legally binding these documents were versus serving as social proof. Meanwhile, the invention of the printing press at the dawn of the 15th century introduced a revolution: mass-produced receipts. Suddenly, merchants could print standardized forms instead of painstakingly handwriting each document. Although the earliest printed receipts were simple and rare, this concept laid the groundwork for the bureaucratic explosion to come. Picture medieval shopkeepers handing over small printed slips instead of those messy medieval scribbles. A novelist might say, "The quill gave way to the press, and receipts became less personal and more official." Don't forget the role of accounting itself, which grew from mere recording to a systematic science, especially with Luca Pacioli, often called the father of accounting, publishing his treatise on double-entry bookkeeping in 1494. This method demanded meticulous documentation of credits and debits, elevating receipts from casual notes to essential financial evidence. It's as if receipts had been promoted from scribbled grocery lists to formal judges in the courtroom of commerce. However, the reign of receipts didn't run uninterruptedly smoothly into the modern age. Some cultures, particularly in oral economies or among nomadic peoples, never fully embraced written receipts. Instead, trust and memory ruled transactions, occasionally supplemented by simpler symbolic tokens. This reminds us that the written receipts we treasure today are not universal. Historians still argue about whether societies without physical receipts had equivalent systems of accountability, or if they relied on entirely different social mechanics. Curiously, in some cultures, receipts even found spiritual, ritualistic overlays. For example, during certain markets or trade ceremonies, a receipt or contract might be blessed or otherwise sanctified, blending religious authority with legal power, a bit like your transaction coming with a heavenly stamp of approval. Such practices remind you that receipts weren't just about numbers, but intertwined with belief and social order. By the Industrial Revolution, receipts became nearly ubiquitous, from factory workers receiving wage slips to shopkeepers handing printed receipts. The evidence trail expanded dramatically. The invention of typewriters and later computers only sped this up, making receipts more legible and systematic. Still, quirkily, paper receipts have also suffered from ephemeral status. Their tendency to fade quickly, the environmental concerns of reams of till receipts. Remember that thermal paper that looks like it disappears overnight. And the rise of digital receipts pose existential questions. Some argue digital receipts are the logical next evolutionary step, potentially the final form of transaction documentation. Others mourn the tactile charm of physical slips and the clear historical through lines they represent. In essence, the tale of receipts is one of fallibility, adaptation, and transformation, from baked clay dried by accidental fires to printed slips tucked in your wallet. Receipts reflect the shifting sands of human society, technology, law, and trust. They survive when civilizations rise or fall, adapting to new media, laws, and even cultural attitudes. And yet, despite all this, many receipts remain as mundane and boring as your emailed confirmation from a coffee shop, proving that in some ways, little has changed. So next time you stash that tissue-thin receipt that will probably fade before morning, remember you're holding a direct descendant of millennia-old clay tablets baked in fiery ruins, signed by scribes whose job security depended on making numbers stick. Legacy, receipts in modern life. As you cradle that faded paper, perhaps crumpled from a long day or flapping silently in a crammed wallet, you're holding a relic of an immense human saga that unfolds even now, with every beep at the checkout counter. Modern receipts are the heirs to a deep lineage, stretching back to sun-baked clay tablets in ancient cities where scribes etched marks to legitimize transactions, preserve trust, and organize life itself. But how did these ancient artifacts morph into the receipts pinged to your phone via email or flashed as QR codes? Tonight, you'll trace that journey into the gleaming present and glimpse where it might drift next. From post-industrial cash register slips to digitally encrypted e-receipts, the trajectory of receipts mirrors the rapid evolution of commerce, technology, and information management. While your ancestors dealt with painstakingly carved tablets and hand-copied parchments, you now interact with receipts that arrive instantly, packed with metadata, timestamps, GPS coordinates, barcodes, and sometimes personalized advertising. Historians still argue whether the sheer data overload risks reducing receipts from useful proofs to impersonal digital clutter, a kind of modern noise that'll make future archaeologists scratch their heads. One of the primary drivers of this modern form is the retail revolution sparked by continuous advancements. From accounting machines in the 19th century to the first computerized cash registers in the 1970s, which slashed errors and sped up transactions. A quirky tidbit: the earliest computerized receipts were printed on heavy green paper, earning the nickname green slips, a nostalgic artifact for vintage tech enthusiasts. Meanwhile, as environmental concerns grow, the printed receipt fights its own battle, prompting many retailers to offer optional e-receipts or reduce the length of printed slips, balancing ecological mindfulness with customer service. The digital age introduced a new arena where receipts evolved beyond mere proof of purchase. They became tools for marketing, customer engagement, and even security. Ever noticed receipts loaded with coupons or messages encouraging you to rate your experience online? That's receipts becoming active participants in shaping consumer behavior rather than passive scribbles. And with blockchain technology entering commerce, experiments with tamper-proof, transparent digital receipts are underway. Imagine a future where your grocery list is permanently etched into an unhackable ledger, immune to fraud or loss. Historians still debate whether such technological bizarreness will substantially reshape everyday transactions or remain niche. Parallel to this tech surge, social and legal shifts frame receipts' significance differently worldwide. In some countries, receipts are vital for tax reporting, warranty claims, and consumer rights, while in others, informal economies persist with limited use of written proof. This disparity reveals that receipts are not just about the act of exchange, but reflect broader cultural approaches to trust, governance, and documentation. Think of receipts as cultural mirrors, showing how societies handle risk and responsibility. In the age of hyperconnectivity, smartphones turn into personal record keepers. Apps aggregate receipts, track budgets, and even sync purchases with calendars. A far cry from the days of scratchy clay tablets requiring professional scribes. Yet, this convenience sparks privacy debates. How much of your purchasing data should be shared with corporations or governments? Are your digital receipts silently charting your habits and preferences? Historians still argue the balance between utility and surveillance in this burgeoning data landscape. Going deeper, the psychological impact of receipts intrigues researchers. They serve as memory anchors in the bustling flow of modern life, supporting cognitive functions like recall and accountability. There's even evidence that receipts can reduce impulse spending, acting as tangible reminders of budgets and limits. Who knew that a tiny slip of paper could serve as a wallet whisperer, nudging you towards more mindful purchasing? Let's not forget the quirky miscellany of modern receipts, like those impossibly long ones at big box stores that fold out like ancient scrolls, or coffee shop receipts printed with personalized jokes. These touches humanize what might otherwise be sterile bureaucratic relics, echoing the ancient tradition of scribes' little flourishes or symbolic tokens embedded in early records. Receipts at their weirdest become cultural artifacts, capturing moments of humor and everyday life after millennia of uninterrupted stewardship. Looking ahead, the future of receipts blends old and new. Environmental concerns push for paperless solutions. Augmented reality might display your purchase history in floating holograms, and AI could transform receipts into predictive financial advisors. Yet, every innovation still wrestles with basic human needs for trust, proof, and transparency, the core that receipts have embodied since that first wedge-shaped mark. So, as you tuck that receipt away or swipe it into digital oblivion, remember you're holding a piece of a story that extends from the bustling bazaars of ancient Mesopotamia all the way to the glowing screens in your pocket. This simple strip of paper or data packet embodies centuries of human ingenuity, adaptation, and the eternal quest to make sense of exchange, a quiet testament to our ever-evolving relationship with commerce and memory. And yes, while you'll probably still lose half of your receipts at the bottom of a bag or the chaos of a junk drawer, at least now you know the exquisite, tangled saga folded into that humble slip. Next time you glance at a receipt, take a moment to marvel at the incredible journey from fired clay to fiber optic cable, and consider how even the most mundane objects carry the weight of history.